Okay, welcome back to video 8, in which we are going to be looking at Stave 2 of A Christmas Carol, in particular the scene in which we meet for the first time the character Little Fan, Scrooge's younger sister. As with the previous videos, I'm going to read through the whole extract first of all, and then we'll be looking at analysing key sections of the text. If you want to skip to the analysis, the timings are just below the video. Okay, so the ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost and with a mournful shaking of his head glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and are never to come back here. Oh, but first we're all going to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." "You are quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box, there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that was ever seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered instalments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the post-boy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied on to the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoar-frost and snow off from the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost, "but she had a large heart." "So she did," cried Scrooge. "You're right, I will not gainsay, Spirit. God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children." "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew?" Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, "Yes." Okay, so a really short little scene, this one, but a really important one in understanding the importance of family in Scrooge's life. We see here that he did have family members that he loved dearly, in particular his younger sister, Little Fan. We are given just slight hints about a cruel, perhaps quite harsh father figure, but we are left to wonder why it is that Scrooge in his present day pushes away his nephew Fred, who is revealed to be Little Fan's son, someone that he clearly had great care and love and respect for, Little Fan. So why is he rejecting her son, his nephew? What has happened in his life that causes him to push away the only family he has left? Okay, so first of all, let's look at the way that Dickens characterises Little Fan. So she's described as a little girl, much younger than the boy. So she's considerably younger than Scrooge, and she puts her arms about his neck and kisses him and calls him dear, dear brother. So we see immediately we've gone back to another Christmas from Scrooge's childhood. Once again, he is alone at school at Christmas. It's interesting that this time he's not reading. Instead, he's walking up and down in despair. So this perhaps suggests to us that over time the isolation at school at Christmas takes a heavier toll upon him. He finds it harder to cope with, whereas previously he's been able to distract himself by reading and imagining these characters. Now it seems as though he's really in some sort of distress. So when little Fan bursts in, he seems surprised, but she overwhelms him with affection and this sort of loving attitude. So he's visited by his younger sister Fan, and she is the embodiment of innocence and youth and goodness. So she is a character that basically represents all of those things. She represents goodness and innocence and kind of the innocence of children. So here she's depicted as very affectionate and loving towards her brother. She hugs him, she kisses him, and she calls him dear, dear twice, suggesting this sort of overflowing affection that she has for him. And it's really hard to kind of reconcile this with Scrooge's attitudes later in Stave 1 when he's older, because he is himself so cold and so bitter, and we wonder how it can be that these are two people that are related. But think about the way that Fred greets Scrooge, joyful, rosy-cheeked, exuding happiness and kindness, and we can see here that sort of resemblance with little Fan, again representing all of the goodness and the joy that family can offer. And so the child is seen again very innocently, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. She's presented as really joyful in her gestures. Dickens chooses these words to suggest this sort of bubbling excitement that she has about bringing her brother home. We get the impression she's missed him, she wants him back with the family. And the way that she speaks even is playful and excitable. Look at the way she repeats words. Dear, dear brother, to bring you home, home, home. So we get the impression she's really excited, and this sort of innocent playfulness is quite characteristic of her here. Home, little Fan, returned the boy. So Scrooge questions this as a child, but she is brimful of glee, so she's filled up with happiness and joy. And he's to be brought home for ever and ever, where he's to become a man and never come back to school. So we get this idea that he's leaving behind this period of isolation. He's going to go back to a happy family. However, Dickens just gives us this hint that not everything is as joyful as little Fan perhaps gives us the impression that it is, or at least it hasn't always been that way. So Dickens just hints at cruel treatment in Scrooge's past. His father is so much kinder than he used to be, suggesting that previously he hasn't been kind. And we sort of realise that perhaps this is the reason that Scrooge hasn't been allowed to come home for Christmas before, that his father has insisted that he remain at the school. So little Fan's sweetness and innocence are again depicted in this simile that home's like heaven, and we get that slight hint there at her Christian faith as well in the use of that comparison, that home feels heavenly. But if we just look at these lines below, he spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. So previously this has been something that she's been too afraid to bring up. And it just gives us that clue that Scrooge's father perhaps has some of that hostility, some of that cruelty that we see in Scrooge in Stave 1. So, there is this excitement on the horizon, the prospect of the merriest time in all the world. He's going to be brought home to celebrate Christmas, and this is going to be something, that we would perhaps think of Christmas as being a time for family being together, a time for love, a time for joy. It's all of those things that Dickens wants to present about Christmas. This is what he's being brought home to enjoy. So he praises her. You are quite a woman, little Fan, and we know that he's being affectionate, he's being kind in return because we know she is a little child. And again, she claps, she laughs, she touches his head, but she's too little, so she just laughs and stands on tiptoe and hugs him, and then drags him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he is happy to leave and goes with her. So this makes us realise, doesn't it, that Scrooge hasn't only experienced isolation and cruelty in his past. It hasn't all been neglect and a solitary life. He's experienced kindness too. So this makes us realise that his childhood isn't the only reason, it can't be, surely, the only reason for his unkind nature as an adult. There are other things that must have occurred. So we see here that Scrooge's life as a young man seems to be improving. We then have a little bit of kind of characteristic Dickensian humour again, in terms of the way that the schoolmaster is described. It's a very sort of fearsome and sort of condescending, intimidating figure. And we see again the slight kind of harsh treatment here. He brings a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, which doesn't really sound like a very appetising meal, and sends some out to the postboy, who says, "Thanks very much for the gesture, but if it's the same wine as you gave me last time, I think I'd rather not." So we get the impression that this isn't really that generous, that they're being given things that perhaps are not going to be missed. So they set off home, but the ghost then turns to adult Scrooge, who's been brought back to revisit this scene, and refers to little Fan in the past tense, always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart, and we realise that little Fan has died. So Dickens uses metaphorical language to illustrate her fragility, whom a breath might have withered, as if she would faint away at a breath of air. So this suggests to us that perhaps she hasn't always been in the best of health, that despite her innocence and despite her loving nature, unfortunately she hasn't survived long into adulthood. But Scrooge repeats, "So she had." So he's remembering her kindness and loving nature. "You're right, I will not gainsay it, Spirit, God forbid." So he's reflecting on the love and the kindness that he has been shown previously by his family. And the ghost points out that she had children. And Scrooge corrects the ghost and says, "One child." And the ghost says, "Your nephew." So we realise that Scrooge's family in the present day is really very small. Fred is seemingly the only relative that he has left alive. And Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, "Yes." So, again, we have Scrooge contemplating his behaviours in the present and reflecting upon the way that he behaves, the way that he acts. So Dickens reveals that Fred is little Fan's son, and we are left to question why Scrooge rejects the child of his beloved sister. He clearly adores little Fan, and she clearly was, very loving and kind towards him. So why is it that he doesn't show the same love and kindness to Fred? Scrooge seems troubled to have been reminded of this connection and is uneasy in his mind, and we might infer that that is his conscience. He's uneasy in his mind because he thinks about the way that he was treated by his sister, and he knows that he doesn't treat Fred in the same way. Dickens implies here that he's questioning the choices that he is making as an adult in turning away his only living family. We wonder also whether, perhaps, he's reflecting on little Fan's kindness and her loving nature and realising that he's pushing away the opportunity to experience the joys of family again. So we think about how happy he clearly is in little Fan's company here, how much he must have enjoyed having the love of family around him, but he rejects the opportunity to experience that again. He turns away from Fred and casts him out of his office, despite Fred's attempts to bring him round for dinner. So we see him here questioning whether that was the right choice. Okay. Thank you very much for listening with this next extract. I hope that this has been useful in helping you to understand the relationship between Scrooge and his sister. I hope it's been helpful in understanding why Little Fan, a character who only appears very briefly, is such a significant one in helping us to understand Scrooge. Okay, thanks very much. I'll catch you next time.